Okay, we're going to be talking about, the book is Prevent and Reverse Stroke and Heart Attack. It's by me, Pete Rogers. We're going to talk about membrane ion pumps, potassium, sodium, metaphors for that, and why that is related to hypertension. So every cell has a plasma membrane, sodium, potassium, ATP pump. It's called active transport because it requires using up an ATP. You always have to have magnesium when you have an ATP because it hangs on to the outer two phosphates so they don't pull apart prematurely. You're letting in 2 positive charges on the potassium coming in, and you're pumping out 3 positive charges with the sodium going out. So there's a net positive charge going out. So there's a positive current of ions going out. There's charge separation across the plasma membrane. So this is a battery with charge separation and current flow. That's a battery. And this is the electrical power that the cell uses to do just about all the work across the plasma membrane. You'll have a gradient where the sodium concentration is 10 times higher outside the cell than inside the cell. You can think of sodium as being the angry poor trying to break into the city, and the city is the cell. So sodium really wants to get into that cell, and because of that, you can couple the energy of sodium entering the cell to pumping other things out, like pumping calcium out in this example right here. Sodium wants to come into the cell for 2 reasons. Number one, it wants to equalize its concentration gradient. It's 10 times higher outside the cell. Number two, the inner surface of the cell has a negative charge in it, negative 65 millivolts, because you've been pumping out positive current. And for that reason, sodium wants to head, it itself has a 1 plus positive charge, so it wants to head towards the negative charge of the inside of the cell. Okay. The way you can remember that normally sodium and calcium are high in the extracellular matrix is extracellular matrix, extracellular space is like the ocean. So God made life in the ocean, and He made He had to take the first cell and enclose it in a plasma membrane and then pump the sodium and the calcium out of it. So the result, in order to be able to put anything else in, because you have to have an equal amount of ions across both sides of the plasma membrane in order for it to equilibrate, and otherwise water would just come in and make it swell if it had too many ions. That's charged particles on the inside of it. Okay, so what all this means is you're always going to have high salt, because God made life in salt water outside the cell. You're always going to have high calcium outside the cell because the salt water of the sea rinses over the rocks, the calcium carbonate limestone. All right, so just remember that the extracellular space is always, always, always high in sodium and calcium. If you remember that, physiology would be really easy for you. If you don't remember that, it's going to be hard. Okay, and in the opposite situation, the counteracting ions to sodium and calcium are the ones that live outside. The ones that live inside are potassium and magnesium. Okay, potassium is the key to intracellular concentration. It's about 10 times higher inside than it is outside the cell. Okay, and magnesium is higher inside the cell. Okay, just remember that, and everything else is going to make sense. The K in potassium stands for kalium, the Latin word for potassium. The N, or Na, stands for natrium, the Latin word for sodium. The cell uses a lot of its energy. This, by the way, is a great book. If you want to understand plasma membrane ion pumps, this is by far the greatest book ever written on that subject. It's called The High Blood Pressure Solution by Richard Moore, MD, PhD. He spent most of his life doing research on these membrane ion pumps, and it's a brilliant book. And he makes it clear how it's a battery and how it's doing all the work across the cell membrane, because once you establish that gradient of sodium, it's coupled to everything else, to pumping protons out, to handling amino acids, to pumping calcium out. It basically is electrical energy of the cell membrane. Okay, normally our ancestors probably ate about 15 to 20 times more potassium than sodium, whereas modern humans have a tendency to reverse that. They'll eat, 10 or 15 times more sodium than potassium. So we've messed up our natural diet. P for potassium. Potassium comes from plants because it's an intracellular ion. So if you eat a whole food, that means the cells are intact, and when you eat it, you get the potassium. You get the magnesium. Magnesium is located in the center of chlorophyll. On the other hand, with processed foods, you don't get any, because they grind up the processed food, rinse it with water, rinse it with solvents, and they rinse away all the potassium and the magnesium. So then they add salt back to it, sodium, to make it taste better, and there's a preservative. So processed foods, they're almost always high in sodium, low in potassium and magnesium. Again, magnesium's in the center of chlorophyll, so you eat the plant, you get the magnesium. They're the good guys. They're the ones you want. Here's magnesium. One of the reasons why I also say it's a hero. It hangs on to the second and third phosphate, using its double 2+ positive charge to hang on to those negative charges so they don't break apart prematurely. So it makes sure that you don't release that extra phosphate until the ATP pump, for example, is ready to use it effectively. That's key to make everything work. If you're low in magnesium, your ATP related processes don't work so well. And here is showing magnesium that it's located in the center of chlorophyll. And now here's another important point, is that the amount of potassium and sodium, well, first of all, we'll talk about the ratio. The amount of potassium you eat relative to the amount of sodium you eat is called the K factor. At a minimum, you want to eat about at least 5 times more potassium than sodium if you're going to have a normal blood pressure. Meat's about 4 to 1. So meat is bad, but it's not super bad. Processed foods are really bad. Okay, fruits tend to be really high. I think I might have a diagram of it. Let's see. Or a chart of it. Okay, one more thing I'll talk about too that's really important is about 98% of the positively charged ions in the cell are this combination of potassium and sodium. And you need that because that's how the cell maintains osmolality. And it's always going to be that way. If you eat lots of sodium and not much potassium, you'll start to accumulate sodium in the cell, which dissipates its concentration gradient. And that's going to weaken the electrical chemical gradient that the cell uses to pump other things. So it's going to weaken, decrease the cell's capacity to do work. And that's a real problem for the cell. Okay. And you can't get around that. That's an important one point I want to make about this. You can't fix this problem with a pill. Okay, there is no way around this. You eat the right diet or you have a problem with your plasma membrane in every cell in your body. And a typical cell will use anywhere from 1/4 to 2/3 of its energy to run that pump. So it's super important that it would use that much of a percentage of its energy to run the pump. So what I'm basically saying is if you don't eat the right food, you basically, done a great disservice to every cell in your body. Why would you want to do that? It's a completely stupid thing to do. And there's no escape from this. You can't work your way around that with a pill. Also, when you eat a lot of sodium, the kidney is designed to preserve sodium and to excrete potassium. You'll start excreting more and more potassium. When you're stressed out, you'll excrete potassium, and you'll also excrete magnesium, and those also contribute to causing hypertension. This is just, again, showing you how a cell works. It has this gradient of 10 to 1, higher sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. It has a gradient of a little more than that, similar to 10 to 1 of potassium's higher inside the cell. So I drew it in bigger letters compared to the outside the cell. When calcium comes into the cell, calcium is like an aristocrat. Calcium is like Big Momma, the matriarch, the boss, who just comes into the house and tells everybody what to do. Tells the kids, pick up your stuff. Tells the old man, you do this. And the point being is, whatever a cell's supposed to do when calcium charges into a cell coming through the plasma membrane channels, it'll activate that cell. So if you need to turn a cell off so the cell can relax and recover, you have to pump that calcium out. You're always pumping that calcium against a gradient to pump it out. So you need a lot of ATP. It means you need good mitochondrial function too. Okay, we talked about the concentrations inside and outside the cell. Okay, now here's what I was getting at with the chart of K factors. The fruits tend to have about 10 to 1 times more. The fruits tend to have much, much higher, like over 100 times more potassium than sodium. That's very common. Like a banana has 450 times more potassium than sodium. So when you eat fruits, you're getting a very high K factor. And that helps prevent hypertension. So fruits help prevent hypertension. When you eat starches, you get more of a K factor in the ballpark of about 20 to 60, which is also fantastic for preventing hypertension. Salads are okay. Salads are about 5 to 15 in terms of K factor. All these processed foods are lousy. You know, look at Cheerios, pretty famous cereal. K factor of only 1.2. Anything below 5 is bad. Meat, ground beef's about 4. Look at something like potato chips. They're terrible, 0.9. And some of these other cereals, Special K, it's like 0.06. Those are terrible numbers. If you're below 5, you're probably going to have hypertension. So that's useful to know. Okay, and I think that's why, you know, like I said, blacks have so much hypertension. They eat so much processed food with so little plant food, whole plant food. So that's where we're going to end it for today. I hope you found that helpful.